Tonight we're stepping into the sweltering heart of ancient Mesopotamia. Not the idealized garden paradise you might picture, but the real Babylon. A city of laws etched in stone, of gods that didn't forgive, and of streets so hot your sandals might stick to them. This isn't a tale of mythic wonder. It's a story of survival, bureaucracy, and heat stroke. And the reason you wouldn't make it past breakfast. I'm the candlelight historian, and this is history as it was lived, unforgiving, unfiltered, and brutally real. Now, relax, take a deep breath, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You open your eyes to the sound of distant shouting, not the kind that signals violence, not yet, but the kind that echoes between stone and brick in a place where everyone's business is everyone else's. The sun is already brutal, bearing down on a city built almost entirely from the one thing Mesopotamia had in abundance: mud, dried, fired, and stacked into endless walls of baked clay. This is Babylon, not a small town or a sleepy outpost, but the most powerful city in the world, depending on the year. And in this particular year, let's call it 1750 BCE, you've just woken up here. Let's be clear, you're not royalty. You're not a priest, a noble, or a scribe. You're not anyone that might make history. You're just here, a visitor, a wanderer, a body with a pulse and little else. That puts you somewhere between a curiosity and a liability. The first thing you'll notice is the smell. Babylon isn't a rotten place. Not exactly, but it's layered. There's the unmistakable tang of livestock, the sour haze of people who haven't bathed in a week, and the acrid sweetness of incense drifting from temple fires. Everything is coated in a fine film of dust, and everything radiates heat. The city is wrapped in two concentric walls, massive things made from millions of bricks, and inside them is a maze. Narrow streets, cluttered courtyards, houses jammed against each other like books on an overcrowded shelf. If you're lucky, you've arrived at the edge of dawn. That means the temperature hasn't yet climbed to the level where bricks feel like frying pans and the air vibrates above rooftops. But even at this hour, Babylon is alive. Vendors are pulling aside woven mats from their stalls. Dogs are barking at nothing. A goat bleats furiously as a child tries to drag it toward somewhere it clearly doesn't want to go. You wander forward. There's no map, not that one would help. Babylon's streets aren't logical. They weren't designed, they evolved. Most of the walkways are packed dirt. Some are paved with slabs of stone, so worn they seem melted at the edges. Every few steps, you pass a clay drain set into the side of the street, meant to carry wastewater from the houses to deeper channels, which hopefully lead somewhere else. They don't always work. You turn a corner and find yourself in a slightly wider alley. Here, the houses rise 2 stories tall, built from thick mud brick walls with timber roofs and upper balconies that lean slightly over the street. Some are painted with red or white plaster, a small touch of dignity in a city constantly battling decay. You might even glimpse a rare bit of colored tile, turquoise or deep blue, hinting at wealth hidden behind those walls. Most buildings here are windowless at street level for security and shade. Instead, small holes are punched high into the walls to let out smoke and heat. The doors are low, and even the grander homes don't have much in the way of signage. This isn't Rome. There are no frescoes advertising wine shops or bathhouses. Everything here is face to face, word of mouth, and passed hand to hand. Suddenly, you realize something odd. You're the only one not sweating. The locals, from children to toothless elders, glisten like statues left in the rain. Their linen tunics cling to damp skin, and most have scarves or shawls to wrap their heads. You, on the other hand, probably dressed for something resembling modest comfort. That was a mistake. The sun's already cooking your shoulders, and the humidity, courtesy of the Euphrates, makes every breath feel like inhaling through a wet cloth. You're also drawing stares, not because you're particularly interesting, but because you don't belong. Your clothes are off. Your walk is off. You paused at the wrong places and failed to nod to the old woman sitting on a stool by the corner shrine. She clocks you instantly as an outsider, then mutters something to the young boy at her side. He darts off, maybe to fetch someone important, or worse, someone bored. But you move on, pretending you haven't noticed. Babylon is too big to worry about every sideways glance. Then, without warning, the city opens up. The narrow streets give way to a broad avenue, the processional way. This is where the gods walk. Well, they're statues anyway. During religious festivals, the sacred images of the gods, Marduk chief among them, are paraded down this street from the towering ziggurat at the city's heart to the outer temple complexes. The path is wide and paved, its walls once lined with glazed bricks in the shape of lions and dragons, gleaming in rich blues and golds. You might be tempted to stop and gawk. Don't. Lingering too long in ceremonial spaces when you're not clearly part of the elite or the priesthood. That's the kind of thing that could attract attention you don't want. Babylon had rules, more than you can imagine, and breaking them didn't end in a fine. Often, it ended with your feet bound and your face in the dirt, awaiting judgment. So you keep moving, turning off the processional way before anyone questions your presence. The back streets seem safer, quieter, at least until you hear the sharp sound of a whip crack, followed by the unmistakable voice of a merchant yelling at his laborers. He's trying to offload amphorae from a cart, the kind used to store beer, wine, or oil, and he's not thrilled about how slowly it's going. It's not your problem, yet. You try another alley, this one lined with tiny shops, weavers, potters, fishmongers. The scent of drying fish mixes with the aroma of fresh bread, and for a moment you forget your panic. You've made it into the city. You're alive. No one's arrested you, yet, but the day is just beginning. The sun has now crept higher, and the dusty gold light of early morning has given way to the full, oppressive weight of the Mesopotamian day. Babylon was no stranger to heat. You're standing in a city that bakes under a sun so unforgiving it might as well be personal. The streets are shimmering with that quiet, invisible ripple. Your clothing sticks to your skin in all the wrong places. Every breath tastes like sand and warm metal. Welcome to a city built almost entirely out of mud, where even the air feels heavy. Babylon's buildings, roads, and temples were mostly made from sun-dried or kill-fired bricks. Stone was a rare luxury, reserved for the temples and palaces of the elite. Almost everything else, from walls to floors to even the city gates, was baked clay. It was functional, cheap, and available, but there was a catch. It didn't age well. The bricks crumbled easily. During the rainy season, streets turned to mush. During the dry season, the dust coated everything. You are quite literally walking through a city that is slowly dissolving and being rebuilt at the same time. If you think you'll catch a breeze, think again. The layout of Babylon's inner quarters was dense and organic. Buildings were stacked shoulder to shoulder, connected by alleys so narrow they could barely fit a donkey cart. This was not an accident. The layout helped with shade and security, but it also meant the wind had no space to breathe. Every street was a pocket of still air, thick with smells and sound. You were living in a very noisy oven. Still, despite the heat and dust, there was order here. Babylon wasn't chaos, at least not entirely. The entire city functioned under a deeply religious and legal framework. Everything had its place. From the temple to the tavern, from the palace to the pigsty, Babylon was structured like an enormous living machine. The gears ground constantly, and you were either inside the machine or under it. Even the direction of movement had rules. Certain streets were used for processions or trade. Others were strictly residential. You wouldn't know this unless someone told you, but stepping into the wrong place at the wrong hour could have consequences. City officials roamed the roads and could drag you in for questioning if they didn't like your face or couldn't understand your accent. There wasn't much tolerance for uncertainty in a city so deeply invested in control. You might think all this rigidity would make Babylon feel tense, but oddly, it didn't. It was noisy, yes. Smelly, certainly. But it was also vibrant. The streets were full of life, people haggling, shouting greetings, chasing livestock, praying, arguing, making trade deals, or simply sitting on clay stools outside their homes, chewing herbs and watching the day go by. There were shrines at every other corner, little cubed structures where incense burned and statues of lesser gods or ancestral spirits sat in dark alcoves. Offerings of dates, onions, or bread sat in small dishes. Sometimes a bit of beer was left to ferment in the heat as a gift to the spirits. Sometimes it was just a way to make the streets smell slightly less like camel. And all of this pulsed to a rhythm dictated by something much older than the city itself. The gods. To the people of Babylon, everything had divine significance. The movement of the sun, the outcome of your trade deal, the sickness in your child's belly, even the way a goat bleated before sunrise. All of it was seen as a sign. The Babylonians believed that the universe was shaped by unseen hands, and those hands were deeply involved in the business of humans. The gods could be generous, but they were also volatile, jealous, and impossible to fully understand. You didn't worship them because they were good. You worshipped them because not doing so might get you killed. That's why nearly every activity in the city had some ritual attached to it. Entering a temple, you needed to be ritually clean. Opening a new shop, better consult an astrologer first. Selling a batch of barley, don't forget the prayer and the right coin for the shrine. Even marriages and funerals had prescribed offerings that, if skipped, would believe to cause bad luck for years. And then there were the festivals. You happened to be here during a lull between major celebrations, but don't get too comfortable. When Babylon threw a festival, it didn't hold back. Roads were cleared. Statues of the gods were paraded through the city on massive wooden carts. Priests chanted prayers that echoed through the alleys. Drums, flutes, lyres, and something that sounded like angry bees in a clay pot, all added to the chaos. People got drunk, animals were sacrificed, debts were sometimes forgiven, and every part of the city seemed to shout for divine attention. It wasn't all public joy. Some rituals were darker, more mysterious. Hidden in the inner sanctums of the great temples, priests performed acts meant to please the gods. No one outside the inner circle truly knew what happened there. What's certain is that it involved blood, fire, and strict hierarchies. You wouldn't be invited. If you tried to sneak in or even linger too long near the temple walls, you might be accused of sacrilege. And in Babylon, sacrilege wasn't a slap on the wrist. It was a full ceremony, trial, punishment, and public humiliation, possibly with a side of death. But we'll get to that later. For now, you wandered deeper into the city, weaving between carts and stepping over lazy dogs. You're trying to find some shade. You won't succeed. Not really. Every spot of shadow is already taken by someone smarter, faster, or more local. You pause by a cracked wall and try to catch your breath. A man nearby eyes you suspiciously. He's older, missing a few teeth, and wears a woven headscarf pulled tight against the sun. He says something in Akkadian, a phrase you don't understand. You shake your head, trying to smile. He keeps staring. Eventually, he spits onto the ground and turns away. You are beginning to realize something. Babylon might be fascinating, full of wonders and divine beauty, but it is not a tourist destination. It is a working city. And you, for all your wide-eyed wonder, are not part of the plan. You step back into the street, coughing as a breeze kicks up a wave of dust into your face. It's dry and gritty, sticking to your tongue and teeth. Somewhere in the distance, a bell rings. Not a church bell, but a heavy metal clang from a blacksmith's shop. It echoes against the walls like a warning. You still haven't eaten. You don't know the laws. You don't speak the language. And the sun is only getting hotter. You're not even an hour into your Babylonian morning when the real danger dawns on you. You've probably already broken the law. That's not paranoia, it's statistics. Babylon was a city governed by one of the earliest and most extensive legal codes ever written, the Code of Hammurabi. You've likely seen the famous image, a tall black stone pillar carved with tiny wedge-shaped characters and topped with a carving of King Hammurabi, receiving authority from the sun god Shamash. But what you may not realize is how obsessively detailed those laws were. There were close to 300 of them, each dealing with specific infractions, punishments, and social roles. They covered theft, contracts, wages, marriage, land disputes, and even how much beer you were allowed to water down before it became a crime. There was a rule for just about everything, and you, dear listener, know precisely none of them. Let's take a simple example. Imagine you stumbled into a house. Not broke in, just wandered in thinking it was a shop or a public space. Maybe the door was open. Maybe you were just looking for help. If the owner accused you of theft, and no one vouched for you, the punishment might not be a slap on the wrist. It might be death. Or perhaps you tried to pay for something using silver coins you happened to bring from your own time. The Babylonian economy worked on silver too, that's true, but silver was weighed, not counted. It was measured out using stone weights on balanced scales. Hand someone a coin and they might not see a customer. They might see a trickster trying to cheat them. Even standing in the wrong spot could put you at risk. If you blocked the passage of a nobleman or priest during a procession, you could be dragged away for interfering with a religious rite. There were rules for how you had to behave during festivals, rules for what to say when approached by temple officials, rules for how loud you could cry during a funeral. All enforceable, all dangerous if ignored. And then there was the concept of lex talionis, the law of retaliation. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. The punishment often mirrored the crime, at least in theory. But that was only if you were of equal status to the person you wronged. That's the other thing Babylon was obsessed with. Status. There were three main social classes: the Oilu, or free person of the upper class, the Mushkenu, the middle class or commoner, and the Wardu, the enslaved. Laws applied differently depending on who you were and who you offended. If you struck a noble, you might lose a hand. If a noble struck you and you were poor, you might just lose your pride, or your teeth, or your life, depending on the mood of the official overseeing your case. Contracts were everywhere. Babylon was a bureaucracy disguised as a city. Want to buy a house? Contract. Want to rent a field? Contract. Want to marry someone? Contract. Divorce? Another contract. Sell your donkey? Yes, you guessed it, more clay tablets. You would need a scribe to help you draft one. That meant paying a literate professional to scratch out rows of cuneiform on wet clay using a stylus. The tablets were then dried and stored, often in private archives or temple collections. Babylon was nothing if not organized. And speaking of scribes, don't pretend you're one. Those men were trained from childhood in temple schools, where they learned to memorize and reproduce thousands of characters. It wasn't just writing. It was a form of power. Scribes could read omens, prepare legal documents, and even serve as government officials. If someone suspected you of faking literacy, of pretending to a role you hadn't earned, well, that was fraud, which, unsurprisingly, was also a punishable offense. You're beginning to feel nervous now. Maybe you smiled at someone's wife a little too long. Maybe you spoke when you should have bowed. Maybe you knocked over a clay vessel that looked insignificant to you but turned out to be an offering to the household god of fertility. You don't know, you're just guessing. That's the problem. The laws weren't printed in booklets. They weren't announced at the city gates each morning. They were inscribed on steles and read aloud at major events. But most people followed them because everyone else did. The culture enforced them. Through habit, tradition, and whispers. You, with your foreign tongue and unfamiliar manners, are outside all of that. Still, there's a bit of dark humor in how precise some of the laws were. For example, if a builder constructed a house and it collapsed and killed the owner's son, the builder's son would be put to death. Not the builder himself. His son. You might raise an eyebrow at that, but Babylon saw justice as a cosmic balance. Actions had weight. That weight had to be redistributed when things went wrong. Even things like bar fights were regulated. If you struck someone and drew blood, there were fines. But if you struck someone of higher status, the punishment could be far worse. You could lose a hand, an eye, or, if the local judge was feeling particularly pious, find yourself conscripted into forced labor in the canals. And here's a fun little fact. If you were accused of something and couldn't prove your innocence, you might be asked to perform a trial by ordeal. For example, being thrown into the river. If you drowned, you were guilty. If you floated, by some miracle, you were innocent. Though by that point, you'd probably wish you'd just paid the fine. It's starting to become clear that Babylon wasn't a place that offered much leniency. Law was sacred, tied to divine order. Hammurabi didn't just create laws, he received them from the gods. Violating them wasn't just a civic offense. It was an act against the very fabric of the universe. You weren't just out of line, you were cosmically wrong. A pair of guards walks past you now. They wear simple tunics, carry short swords, and seem unconcerned with your presence. But they look sharp, alert. One of them glances at you, says something under his breath, and laughs. You're not sure if that's a good sign. You turn down a narrow side alley, your heart thumping a little louder than you'd like to admit. A woman sweeping her doorstep pauses to watch you pass. Her eyes linger just a little too long. It's a strange feeling, being in a place where everything around you is so familiar. People, animals, markets, food, and yet where one wrong gesture might be your last. And you haven't even done anything yet. You're hungry now. Not just hungry, but desperate. The heat has drained you, and the knot of anxiety in your stomach is giving way to something more primal. You need food, you need water, and ideally, you need both without having to sign a clay tablet or lose a finger in the process. Babylon's market awaits. You follow your nose, because frankly, it's doing a better job than your sense of direction. The scent of baking bread cuts through the smell of animals and dust, leading you toward the city's commercial heart. The streets here are wider, the noise louder. Everything is movement, carts creaking, traders shouting, children weaving between stalls with sticky fingers and no supervision. This is where the city truly comes alive. The Babylonian market wasn't a single, clean space. It sprawled through neighborhoods and alleyways, a patchwork of wooden awnings, red mats, and sun-bleached cloth that stretched between buildings. Every few feet, something new demanded your attention. A pile of clay pots, a stack of sandals, baskets of onions, heaps of lentils. Over here, a man is loudly praising the quality of his fish, even as flies settle across their dull, unblinking eyes. Over there, a woman stirs a pot of barley stew over a clay brazier, its steam rising thick and fragrant into the morning air. And then finally, you find it, bread. Small, round loaves, slightly burnt on the edges, stacked neatly on a reed tray. They smell smoky, a little sour, but absolutely divine. You approach. The baker doesn't look up. He's focused on something in the fire. You wait, then clear your throat. He looks at you, squints, then grunts. Now comes the problem. You have no silver, no weights, and absolutely no idea how to communicate your need using ancient Akkadian. You hold out your hand and gesture toward the bread with what you hope is a respectful nod. He raises an eyebrow. Then, with excruciating slowness, he tears one small loaf in half and places it on the edge of the tray. Looking at you expectantly, right, payment. You reach into your pocket, pull out something shiny, maybe a small coin, a bit of metal, anything, to convey trade. He picks it up, turns it over in his hand, then looks back at you with deep suspicion. He says something short and sharp. This is not going well. A crowd has begun to gather. Not because you're causing trouble yet, but because there's nothing Babylon loves more than a spectacle. You're new, you're strange, and now you're confusing the baker, which is entertainment enough. Finally, a young boy steps forward. He speaks quickly to the baker, who snorts, takes your coin anyway, and shoves the half-loaf into your hand. The boy turns to you and says in slow, careful Sumerian, not Akkadian, but close enough. He thinks your money is cursed. I told him you were probably just poor. A kindness, maybe, or a warning. You thank the boy with a nod, take a bite of the bread, and almost choke. It's dense, very dense. More weapon than meal, really. But it's food, and right now that's enough. Water is next. Luckily, Babylon had a sophisticated water system, and luckily it was sophisticated by Bronze Age standards. Large cisterns and wells dotted the city, fed by channels and canals that branched from the Euphrates River. If you were lucky enough to live near a temple, the water might be filtered and stored in clay jars. If not, well, there were always open drains. You find a cluster of people gathered around a communal basin, each waiting their turn to fill clay jugs from a spout. The water smells faintly of algae and copper, but it looks drinkable. You inch forward, trying not to draw attention. Then a voice behind you barks something. You turn. A woman, middle-aged, strong-armed, clearly in charge, points to the end of the line and makes a slashing motion across her chest. You've just tried to cut in line at a water station. That's your second mistake of the hour. You step back quickly, hands raised, mumbling something that sounds vaguely apologetic. The people ahead of you scowl, but say nothing. You wait your turn, scoop a handful of water, and drink. It's lukewarm, slightly gritty. But right now, it tastes like heaven. Bellies somewhat settled, you start to relax, just a little. You've made it through a transaction, avoided a public scolding, and survived your first taste of Babylonian cuisine. But as you walk past the rows of traders, you start to notice something else. Prices are not fixed, not even close. Everyone is haggling. A woman selling onions argues loudly with a man over the weight of a bag. A vendor tries to convince an old farmer that his goat is worth twice what it clearly is. Every deal is a performance. Every price is fluid. If you're not skilled in the art of negotiation, you're going to get robbed. Politely, perhaps, but robbed all the same. And robbery is a two-way street. Pickpockets work the markets just like they do today. One bump, one quick hand, and that strange silver coin you thought might pass for money is gone. A man walks past you a little too closely. You check your pockets. Still there, for now. But theft, as we've already seen, is no joke here. If you're caught stealing, even something small, you could lose a hand. And if you falsely accuse someone of theft, that's punishable too. Babylon didn't take kindly to either criminals or liars. You reach the end of the market and turn into a shaded side street. A group of young boys kick a ragged ball made of reeds and leather between themselves. A woman sits cross-legged outside a small shop, dyeing fabric with her bare hands. The air here is calmer, less frantic. But even here, the rules of trade and law are everywhere. Above one shop hangs a tablet, not a sign, but a record of debts. A list of names, symbols, and numbers scratched into clay and baked dry. Everyone owes someone. Everyone is owed. Babylon runs on credit, obligation, and memory. And nothing is ever forgotten. Your stomach is still hollow, but at least it's not growling. Your throat is dry again, but you know where to find water now. You're surviving, just barely. And yet you can't shake the feeling that you're walking a line you can't see. That every friendly face might be waiting for you to slip. That every bite of bread or drop of water comes with a rule you don't know. One more wrong move, and this market might become a courtroom. Your last meal might have been a farewell gift. By now, you've eaten half a loaf of bread that could double as building material, drank some possibly safe water, and narrowly avoided several legal disasters. You might be tempted to sit down somewhere quiet and wait out the day, but that's not an option here. Babylon is a working city, and if you want to stay in it, or at least avoid being chased out, you'll need a job. Not a dream job, not a career with a corner office and a pension, just something, anything to make yourself less suspicious and slightly more useful. You wander toward the southern part of the city, where the grand avenues fade into the tougher, smokier corners of urban life. Here, the scent of incense is replaced by sweat, and the sound of music gives way to shouting, metal clanging, and the dull thud of hard labor. It's not subtle. This is where Babylon keeps its workers, not hidden, but not showcased either. A man with arms like tree trunks, and a voice that could shatter amphory yells something in your direction. You don't catch the words, but the meaning is clear. Pick up a brick, or keep moving. This is your first job offer. Let's talk about what that means. Babylon was constantly under construction. Walls were being reinforced, temples expanded, homes rebuilt. Everything needed bricks. Thousands of them. And each brick had to be shaped, dried, fired, and hauled. If you weren't a skilled tradesman or a priest, chances were high you'd end up working with bricks in some form or another. You approach the workyard. It's hot. There's no shade. Men and boys shovel clay into wooden molds, then set the soft bricks out in long rows under the sun. Others work the kilns, massive ovens glowing red hot, where the fired bricks are made harder, more durable, and much heavier. You step up to a pile, squat awkwardly, and try lifting one. You immediately regret it. The brick is heavy, awkward, covered in grit. Your arms shake, your back complains, and the laborers around you burst out laughing. One shouts something and mimics your attempt with a dramatic stumble. You've become the morning's entertainment again. Still, no one stops you. If you want to try, no one's going to say no. It's free labor. And if you pass out in the dirt, well, that's one less mouth to feed. You set the brick down, stand, and wipe your hands on your already filthy clothes. Maybe heavy lifting isn't for you. You keep walking. Next up, canal maintenance. Babylon didn't just sit beside the Euphrates. It lived and breathed with it. A complex network of canals fed the fields, the homes, the workshops. These channels had to be cleared constantly. Silt built up. Weeds choked the flow. Sometimes animals wandered in and died, creating a smell that stayed with you for days. Canal dredgers were among the lowest paid laborers in the city. They worked barefoot in mud, waist deep in water, hauling sludge with woven baskets and praying they wouldn't step on anything venomous. You watch them for a while. It's brutal, boring, backbreaking. You decide to keep walking. Eventually, you reach a quieter part of the neighborhood. There's a shaded courtyard where a small group of boys sits cross-legged on mats. In front of them, a man dressed in a tidy linen robe scratches lines into a wet clay tablet. The boys watch closely, copying each stroke with their own styluses. A scribe's call. Becoming a scribe was one of the few ways to rise above hard labor. It required years of training, memorizing hundreds of cuneiform characters, learning arithmetic, geometry, legal phrases, and how to compose official letters. It wasn't easy. The schools were strict. Punishments for mistakes were common. Beatings, usually, or public humiliation. But once trained, scribes were powerful. They controlled contracts, accounts, temple inventories. A king might have dozens of them working in his administration, recording every tax, land grant, and royal decree. You crouch near the edge of the courtyard. The teacher glances up, frowns, then turns back to his students. You don't belong here either. Not without years of training, a wealthy sponsor, or divine intervention. You stand again. A shopkeeper nearby eyes you with curiosity. He's seated outside a small stall filled with dyed cloth, jars of oil, and a few carved wooden items. He waves you over. You point to the goods, gesture in a way that asks help, and give him your best tired smile. He shrugs, pats the ground next to him, and hands you a broom. Progress. For the next hour, you sweep. You carry jars. You hand over small parcels to customers when the shopkeeper nods. No one yells at you. No one threatens you with a knife or a lawsuit. It's not glamorous, but it's honest work. You even get a small cup of barley beer, thick, sour, and full of floating grain, as a kind of midday thank you. But make no mistake, this job isn't permanent. Babylon had no job security for people like you. If you became injured, slow, or simply annoying, you'd be replaced. Workers were everywhere. The city never stopped needing hands, but it never ran out of them either. You might be pressed into state labor next. Every citizen owed time to the crown. That meant building walls, digging canals, or dragging giant stones to temples. Refusing wasn't an option. Not unless you wanted your ears boxed by a city official and your name added to a very unfriendly tablet. Not unless you wanted your ears boxed by a city official and your name added to a very unfriendly tablet. Even those lucky enough to work in temples, as porters, assistants, or kitchen staff, did so under strict supervision. Priests were powerful, but they had no time for mistakes. Burn the wrong incense, prepare the wrong grain, or speak during a sacred moment, and you'd be out. Or worse, punished for sacrilege. The truth is, every job in Babylon was precarious. There were no unions, no holidays, no sick leave. You worked until you dropped, and if you didn't, someone else would. Now, as the sun rises toward its peak, the streets grow quieter. People retreat indoors, behind heavy drapes and mud brick walls. Even the dogs nap in the shade. It's too hot for labor, too bright for comfort. You've made it through the morning. You haven't been arrested. You've eaten. You've worked. You've sweat through every layer of clothing you have. But Babylon isn't finished with you yet. Afternoon is when the gods come calling, and they do not call gently. The air has thickened to the point where it feels like a blanket soaked in warm water. Even the flies seem sluggish now, circling slowly through the afternoon haze. Somewhere, a dog barks once and then gives up. The hum of the city has gone quiet, not because Babylon is resting, but because the divine hours are near. In ancient Babylon, the gods weren't part of the scenery. They were the scenery. They were embedded in every brick, every law, every crop, every cough. And they weren't gentle figures smiling from above. They were powerful, unpredictable, and hungry for attention. You decide to head toward the sacred heart of the city, where the temples rise above the rooftops like stone mountains. It's a short walk, but each step feels heavier than the last. The streets become cleaner here, the homes larger. Even the walls are painted, faded murals in blue and ochre, showing gods with horned crowns, animals with human faces, stars, and winged shapes soaring toward the heavens. Then you see it, the Etemenanki, the ziggurat, towering above the city like a giant staircase. The ziggurat is the pride of Babylon. It's not smooth or graceful like a modern skyscraper. It's massive, blunt, and layered, a series of stacked platforms, each smaller than the last, built from millions of bricks. From a distance, it looks like a pile of clay that's trying to reach the stars. This, according to tradition, is the bridge between heaven and earth. The gods dwell at the top, or so they say. You approach the base, where thick walls encircle the complex. Priests and workers move through arched gates, some carrying bundles of reeds, others hauling jars of oil or grain. You try to follow, but a young priest steps into your path. He's not tall, but he's fast. His shaved head glistens in the sun, and his white linen robe is crisp, freshly laundered, a status symbol in a city full of dust. He says something. You don't understand it, but the tone is clear. You don't belong here. You back away. Access to the ziggurat wasn't open to everyone. Only the highest-ranking priests, nobles, and temple workers were allowed past a certain point. Ordinary citizens brought offerings to smaller shrines nearby, cakes, dates, incense, occasionally livestock, but the innermost sanctuaries were forbidden to most. Babylon's gods didn't mix with just anyone. You walk along the outer wall and find a quieter entrance, a small courtyard with a low altar. Here, commoners are kneeling on woven mats, heads bowed, murmuring prayers. You hear the names spoken softly: Marduk, the great lord of Babylon; Ishtar, the fierce goddess of love and war; Shamash, the sun god and bringer of justice. Each god has their role, their preferences, their quirks. Anger, one, and the others might not save you. That's the thing about divine order in Babylon. It wasn't comforting. It was complicated. The gods could be benevolent, but only when properly appeased. If something went wrong in your life, illness, crop failure, theft, even a stubbed toe, chances were high someone would say you'd offended a god. Not just a god, but the wrong god. Maybe you burned the wrong incense. Maybe you walked past a shrine without nodding. Maybe your neighbor whispered a curse in your name, and the gods listened. So you paid. In offerings, in rituals, in silence. And no one knew the rituals better than the priests. They weren't just religious leaders. They were astronomers, doctors, bureaucrats, dream interpreters, and judges. Their role was to maintain balance between the human and divine realms. They kept calendars, recorded eclipses, performed sacrifices, and issued decisions that affected every corner of life. And they did not make mistakes, or rather, when they did, no one said so out loud. You watch one of them step forward now, his arms raised toward the altar. A hush falls over the courtyard. He chants something in a rhythm so old it doesn't sound like language anymore. Then he pours oil onto the altar stone, watching the way the smoke curls, reading it like others might read a letter. It's a message, but only he can interpret it. After a few moments, he nods once, steps back, and leaves. The gathered crowd exhales, as if they were all holding their breath at once. You take it as your cue to move on. Down a side passage, you find another shrine, smaller but more personal. A woman kneels alone before a statue of Gula, the goddess of healing. She holds a clay jar in one hand and weeps softly into the other. A child lies behind her on a reed mat, eyes closed, limbs still. You don't know if the child is sleeping or gone, but the mother's face tells you everything. In Babylon, there were temples for healing, yes, but there were no hospitals, no reliable medicine, no guarantees. The gods were your best hope, and sometimes your only one. You leave them behind, stepping through another gate and into a quieter space. Here, a line of priests walks past, each carrying a bundle of herbs. They're preparing for a cleansing ritual, most likely, not for sin, but for impurity. Things like touching a corpse, seeing a bad omen, or speaking during the wrong phase of the moon. It's easy to laugh at it now, all these rules, all this smoke and chanting. But if you lived here, it would be no joke. Because if the gods were displeased, it wasn't just your personal life that suffered. They could punish the whole city. Floods, plague, war, drought. And then everyone would blame the person who forgot to light the right fire. Maybe even you. You walk back toward the outer gate, glancing once more at the ziggurat. It looms above you like a mountain that doesn't care whether you live or die. It simply is, like the gods, like the laws, like the heat that presses against your skin without apology. A nearby priest sees you looking and frowns. He walks your way, you turn and leave. Quickly, you've spent enough time in the presence of gods for one day. Back in the dusty alleys of the city, you feel strangely relieved. The world here may be chaotic and brutal, but at least it's human, the divine. That's a level of danger you're not prepared to face, and it's far from over. Because in Babylon, the line between prayer and punishment is thinner than you think. You've barely escaped the wary eye of a temple priest, your mouth still dry from nerves, when your next problem begins to brew, a deep, uncomfortable cramp twisting in your gut. It could be the heat, could be the nerves. More likely, It's that half loaf of brick-like barley bread you wolfed down earlier. Either way, you're not feeling your best. Which brings us to a fun and underappreciated corner of Babylonian life: medicine. Or, to be more accurate, the strange and tangled combination of medicine, magic, and mud that passed for healthcare here. Let's start with this. Babylonian healers weren't just doctors. They were priests, astrologers, sorcerers, and herbalists, often all at once. The people who treated illness didn't simply examine your symptoms and write a prescription. They examined your dreams, read omens, recited spells, and sometimes buried little dolls in the dirt near your house. You couldn't just say, "My head hurts." You had to explain when the pain began, what color your urine was, whether your left eye twitched at sunrise, and whether a black dog barked outside your window 3 days ago. Every detail mattered. Every symptom had cosmic implications. Let's say you're desperate enough to seek help. You ask around, mostly with wild gestures and awkward miming, until someone points you to a narrow doorway marked by a small clay tablet etched with the symbol for Gula, goddess of healing. You duck inside. The healer's house is quiet and dim, cooled by thick brick walls and a high ceiling strung with woven mats. Bundles of herbs hang from beams. Dried roots and seeds sit in clay bowls, neatly arranged by shape and size. On a low table, there's a collection of carved amulets, some shaped like animals, others like tiny, screaming faces. The healer himself sits cross-legged on a woven mat, chewing something that smells like mint and ash. He looks up as you enter, studies you for a long moment, then pats the mat in front of him. You sit. Now the diagnosis begins. He asks you questions. You don't understand most of them. You nod anyway. He nods back, as if you've confirmed a suspicion. Then he begins the real work. First he inspects your eyes and tongue. Then he sprinkles a little flour into a bowl of water and watches how it floats. He chants softly, rhythmically, in a tone somewhere between prayer and lullaby. Then he reaches behind him and pulls out something that looks suspiciously like dried lizard skin. This is where things get strange. Babylonian medicine was partly based on observation. Healers knew that certain plants helped with pain, swelling, or fever. They used willow bark, garlic, myrrh, mustard seed. They treated wounds with honey and clay. They even recognized the dangers of spoiled food and dirty water, though they lacked the language to explain it in terms of bacteria. But alongside this practical knowledge came a flood of magical thinking. Illness wasn't just physical. It could be caused by demons, curses, angry ghosts, or divine punishment. So healing required more than herbs. It required spells. The healer begins to chant louder now, tracing a pattern in the dust beside you with his finger. He presses something into your palm, a soft clay amulet with a cuneiform symbol pressed into its surface. Then he takes a pinch of powdered root and blows it across your forehead. This, apparently, is part of the cure. He gives you a small jar filled with paste. You don't ask what's in it. He gestures for you to rub it on your belly, drink a small spoonful, and bury the rest outside your door at sunset. You nod. Payment is due, of course. You give him the only silver coin you have left, one he eyes suspiciously, then pockets anyway. It seems you've become a known quantity in this neighborhood. You step back into the street, clutching your mysterious remedy and hoping it doesn't contain anything still alive. But you're not finished. In Babylon, medicine wasn't just about the individual. If you were visibly sick, vomiting in public, covered in rashes, staggering around like you'd seen too many eclipses, People might report you to the temple, not to help, to protect themselves. The priests could declare you ritually impure. That meant you might be banned from public spaces, forbidden from touching others, required to stay in your home and undergo purification rituals. In extreme cases, you might be exiled until the symptoms passed, or didn't. Worse still, some illnesses were interpreted as omens. A sudden fever in one part of the city, a sign that the gods were displeased. A rash of miscarriages among women, proof of divine punishment. In those cases, the entire neighborhood might be called to offer sacrifices and prayers, and someone would need to take the blame. You do not want that to be you, so you keep your head down. You walk carefully. You drink water when no one is looking and try not to vomit in public. By late afternoon, your stomach has settled slightly. Whether it was the powder, the prayer, or just time doing its work, you're no longer doubled over in pain. But your legs are shaky. Your mouth tastes like metal. And your hands are still lightly coated in whatever the healer gave you. You wipe them on your tunic and keep walking. You pass another shrine, this one dedicated to Nergal, god of plague and the underworld. You do not stop. You do not want his attention. Further down the street, you see a woman preparing a poultice from crushed leaves and hot ash. A child sobs nearby, clutching a swollen ankle. She doesn't chant or pray. She simply works, fast and focused. Not every healer in Babylon wore priests' robes. Mothers, midwives, even grandmothers carried generations of knowledge. The kind passed not in tablets, but in quiet whispers over steaming pots and midnight illness. You nod to her as you pass. She doesn't look up. By now, the city is beginning to shift again. The sun is still high, but the worst heat has broken. People are stirring. Shops reopen. Doors creak. A drumbeat echoes from somewhere deep in the city, slow and steady, a signal of something beginning. You wonder if you're cured. You wonder if you were ever sick. You wonder what that lizard skin was for. You'll never know. In Babylon, certainty is a luxury. You take your survival where you can find it, and so far, you're still upright. Barely. The sun has finally dipped low enough that the buildings cast long, angular shadows across the streets. The air feels lighter, just barely, and the scent of evening cook fires is beginning to drift through the alleys. But before you start thinking about rest, or food, or even finding somewhere to sit down, you need to learn one more thing. In Babylon, relationships weren't built on love stories. They were built on contracts. You're about to see what that means. You wander into a quieter part of the city, where the noise of the market fades and the walls seem to lean a little closer together. It's a residential area, if such a word can be applied to a place without doors that lock. The mud brick homes here are stacked and cramped. Families often lived shoulder to shoulder, multiple generations under one roof, sometimes even multiple families. You pass a couple seated on a small platform outside their home. The man is sharpening a knife. The woman is weaving a basket. They don't speak, but the space between them is filled with years of practiced silence. There is no public affection, no hand-holding. In Babylon, marriage wasn't about romance. It was about survival. Marriage contracts were standard practice. Before a couple could marry, their families negotiated the terms, including the dowry, the bride price, and what would happen if things didn't work out. Once agreed, a scribe recorded the details on a clay tablet. Everyone involved, bride, groom, and families, would press their seals into the soft clay to make it official. It wasn't just a formality, it was law. If a man failed to provide for his wife, she could take him to court. If a woman was caught cheating, the penalties could be severe. In some cases, both the woman and her lover could be drowned in the river. You turn a corner and see a wedding procession approaching. It's not loud or joyful, it's organized. The bride walks at the center, head covered, eyes down. She's flanked by family members on either side, some carrying bundles, possibly part of the dowry. The groom follows behind, not beside her. He doesn't smile. He looks nervous. Maybe he should be. Weddings were serious business. So was divorce. Divorce was permitted, but not easy. A husband could dismiss his wife for specific reasons: infertility, disobedience, or if she was no longer pleasing. But he had to compensate her. If she brought a dowry, he had to return it. If she bore him children, he had to provide for them. Women, too, could seek divorce in certain cases. If a husband was cruel, neglectful, or unfaithful, a woman could petition the court to be released. But success wasn't guaranteed, and the court didn't always take kindly to female complaints. You pass a small courtyard where an older woman sits surrounded by children, weaving and teaching them to do the same. She isn't a grandmother. She's a servant, or more likely, a slave. But the lines between roles blur quickly here. Not every woman in Babylon lived in a home with a contract and a dowry. Some lived under the will of their masters, with no legal protections at all. Women's lives in Babylon were complicated. They could own property, run businesses, and even lend money. Some worked as merchants, brewers, weavers, or temple staff. In rare cases, a woman might become a high priestess, wielding considerable influence. But these were exceptions. For most, life was structured, constrained, and filled with risk. Take childbirth, for example. Without modern medicine, childbirth was one of the leading causes of death for women. It wasn't just dangerous, it was constant. A woman might bear 10 children in her lifetime. Half might die young. The rest would carry on the family line if they survived long enough to marry themselves. Love, as you understand it, wasn't the point. Marriage was a tool, a contract for building alliances, sharing labor, and producing children. You sit near a small shrine tucked into a wall. It's dedicated to Ishtar, goddess of love, sex, and war. A strange combination, but fitting. In Babylon, love could elevate or destroy. Ishtar was worshipped with offerings of perfume, incense, and sometimes other things. There are rumors, ancient and often exaggerated, about sacred prostitution in her temples. Most modern scholars agree it wasn't what people imagine. But sexuality was still seen as divine. Fertility, passion, and desire were part of the cosmic order. And sometimes they were dangerous. You watch as a young man approaches the shrine, presses his forehead to the wall, and leaves a single fig in a shallow dish. Maybe he's praying for love or revenge. With Ishtar, the line between the two was thin. In Babylon, attraction didn't come with flowers and whispered promises. It came with consequences. If an unmarried woman was caught in an affair, she could be punished severely, unless her father refused to press charges. Fathers had the legal power to spare their daughters or send them to trial. Power in Babylon wasn't just about kings and priests. It existed inside families too. The roles were rigid, expectations clear. A man provided, a woman obeyed. Children were trained early to follow the path laid out before them. Any deviation risked shame, or worse, you leave the shrine and continue walking. The evening light is growing softer now, golden and calm. You pass a couple sitting on their rooftop. He's eating. She's braiding her hair. They don't speak, but the quiet rhythm between them is easy to read. There is affection here. Not loud, not romantic in the way you'd expect, but real. Even in a city of contracts and punishments, people still found ways to care. But caring came at a cost. In Babylon, love wasn't blind. It was measured in silver, sealed in clay, and judged by gods who didn't believe in happy endings. You keep walking, because if you linger too long, someone might ask who you're married to. And in this city, not having an answer is its own kind of crime. By now, the city has shifted into its evening rhythm. The worst of the heat has passed, though the bricks beneath your feet still radiate the memory of the sun. Shadows stretch longer, doors open wider, smoke from hearth fires curls lazily upward. It's tempting to think that Babylon is relaxing, but that's not quite right. It's transitioning, and with this transition comes a new cast of characters. The workers who never stopped, and the scribes who never seemed to sweat at all. You pass a group of men hauling heavy baskets of clay, their backs bent, their feet caked in mud. These are canal workers, or brickmen, or dockhands. You're not sure anymore. They speak little, grunt often, and move in practiced unison. One of them pauses to drink from a clay cup, then hands it to the next without a word. There's a rhythm to this kind of life. Repetitive, brutal, but it gets things done. Further down the street, you come across a different scene entirely. A boy, maybe 12, is standing beside a man in a long robe, carefully copying a line of cuneiform onto a soft clay tablet. The man watches without speaking. When the boy finishes, the man takes the tablet, inspects it, then raps the boy lightly on the back of the head and hands it back. Scribes. They don't lift anything heavier than a stylus, but they carry immense power. Babylon was a literate city, not in the modern sense, where most people could read and write, but in the sense that the state was literate. Everything was documented, every transaction, every law, every prayer, and every promise. And the scribes were the ones who kept that machinery moving. They were trained from childhood, usually the sons of other scribes or priests. Their education was strict, their discipline even stricter. Mistakes weren't corrected, they were punished. You didn't just memorize symbols, you memorized formulas, legal phrases, royal titles, and whole sections of sacred texts. By adulthood, a scribe could produce a perfectly aligned tablet of wedge-shaped characters with astonishing speed, and that meant he could document a marriage, record a sale, resolve a dispute, or write an official charge that might land someone in a courtroom. Or worse, you watch as the boy continues his lesson, tongue between his teeth in concentration. His hands are steady. His future is solid. You, meanwhile, have none of these skills, and that puts you closer to the other side of the city's labor force. The enslaved. Slavery in Babylon wasn't based on race. It wasn't about permanent status, necessarily. A slave could be someone who owed a debt, someone captured in war, someone born to enslaved parents, or someone sold into bondage by their own family to pay off obligations. It was cruel, and yet it was structured. Slaves had some legal protections. A master couldn't kill them without cause, though cause was a loose term. Slaves could own small amounts of property. They could marry. They could even buy their freedom, if they ever managed to save enough. But mostly, they worked. You pass a row of small courtyards where groups of women, young and old, grind grain using stone tools. The motion is slow, circular, and endless. Next to them, older men repair baskets or haul water. No one speaks unless necessary. One woman notices you watching and stares back with a look that's hard to read. Not fear, not curiosity, just tired certainty. You move on. Further down the road, you stumble upon a small group gathered around a table under an awning. One man, lean, sharp-featured, and better dressed than the others, is reading aloud from a clay tablet. The others listen closely. Occasionally, they nod. One frowns and says something short. Another crosses his arms. They're negotiating. This is what business looks like in Babylon. There's no ink, no parchment, just clay. Everything is recorded on tablets, contracts for land, loans, labor, dowries, rental agreements. Once written, the tablet is baked or dried, then stored in the family archive or the temples, or sometimes in a special jar buried beneath the threshold of a home. Deals are formal, even among friends, and you're seeing why scribes were so essential. Without them, nothing was official, and without official, nothing had legal weight. You sit nearby and listen, though you don't understand a word. The rhythm of it is oddly familiar, the haggling, the back and forth, the calculating glances. Human nature doesn't change. What has changed is how much of that nature was locked in law. You realize now that Babylon didn't run on fear alone. It ran on memory, the memory of clay. Every agreement, every settlement, every accusation, recorded, archived, retrievable. It made the city feel permanent, solid, as if nothing could be forgotten. But memory, especially in this world, was a privilege. The people you passed earlier, the workers, the slaves, they would be remembered only if someone important wrote their names down. If they died in a canal trench or vanished during a drought, no tablet would mark the loss. But a scribe who misspelled a noble's name, that mistake could live forever. Get up again, legs sore, shoulders burned. The sun is dropping now, brushing the edges of the ziggurat with orange light. You walk past a group of young scribes seated in a line, sharing a fig and laughing over something scratched onto a tablet, probably a joke. Yes, even jokes were written down. They glance at you briefly, then turn back to their work. You're not one of them. You don't belong at the table. But you understand, now, how this city keeps moving. It isn't just the labor, it's the record of the labor, the proof that someone did the work, the permanent memory that someone, for better or worse, lived, and tomorrow they'll write it all down again. Dusk drapes itself gently over the rooftops. The last rays of sunlight flicker off the temple walls, while the city of Babylon slips into its next shape, quieter, darker, but no less dangerous. If you were hoping the evening would bring peace, think again, because now it's time to talk about crime, and more importantly, punishment. Babylon may have been a city of gods and scribes, but it was also a city full of people. And wherever there are people, there are problems, jealousy, greed, betrayal, desperation, and plain stupidity. Babylon had its share of thieves, liars, cheats, and brawlers. Some were petty, some were foolish, some were clever enough to get away with it, but most weren't. That's where the system kicked in. You hear the commotion before you see it. A group has gathered in a narrow street. People press in close, craning their necks toward the center of the crowd. A man stands with his arms bound behind him, his face streaked with sweat and dust. He's shouting, or maybe pleading. It's hard to tell. His accuser, A smaller man, with a proud expression and a very firm grip on a clay tablet, steps forward and raises his voice. You don't catch the words, but the meaning is obvious. Someone has been caught stealing. Now comes the judgment. In Babylon, trials didn't look like what you'd imagine. No powdered wigs, no gavel, no solemn rows of jurors. Justice happened fast. Witnesses were called, if available. If not, decisions were made based on testimony, reputation, and sometimes divine guidance. And then there were the punishments. You've already heard the famous phrase, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. But Babylon didn't stop there. If a man stole from a temple or palace, the punishment was death. Stealing from a private home might mean returning the item and having your hand cut off. False accusation. The accuser would receive the punishment they intended for their victim. There was a twisted logic to it. The punishment often mirrored the crime, built to discourage dishonesty and enforce a sense of cosmic balance. But it could get messy. Sometimes punishments were public. Executions, whippings, or the display of a criminal's body near the city gates. Other times, penalties were financial. A fine paid in silver or goods. And in some cases, punishments were symbolic. There's a law, for example, stating that if a man kisses another man's wife without permission, he must stand before a judge and be publicly shamed, a formal reprimand that leaves no scars but plenty of damage to the ego. The point wasn't just to punish, it was to humiliate, to make sure everyone watching would remember what happened and, more importantly, why. Back in the crowd, the shouting stops. The bound man is pulled away by two guards. No one cheers, no one weeps. The crowd disperses like mist, returning to their evening errands. You stand there for a moment, unsure of what you've just witnessed. A small voice inside you says, keep your head down and never, ever get caught. But crime wasn't always so obvious. You pass a woman selling wine from a jug. Nearby, a man leans too close to her stand, palms something from the edge, and walks away. She sees him, says nothing. Not worth it, maybe, not tonight. Then again, Babylon had its own version of police, city officials and temple guards who handled security. They weren't everywhere. They didn't prevent all crime, but they were always around when it mattered most, especially when the gods or the royal family were involved. And there was always the river, when evidence was lacking, or when an accusation couldn't be proved. Babylon sometimes turned to divine judgment, trial by ordeal. The most famous involved the river. If two people disputed ownership of something, and there was no proof, no tablet, no witness, one or both might be thrown into the Euphrates. If you sank, you were guilty. If you floated, you were innocent. This wasn't about logic, it was about fate. If the gods wanted you to survive, you would. Of course, it helped to be a good swimmer. You stroll past the outer wall of a temple complex now, where a young man scrubs away a red smear on the brick. Maybe wine, maybe not. Behind him, oil lamps flicker inside narrow windows. The shadows of the city are stretching longer, more private now, less forgiving. You think of the punishments written into Hammurabi's code. Some of them were oddly specific. If a builder constructed a house and it collapsed and killed the owner's son, the builder's son would be killed in return. If a man bit another man's nose, he'd have his own nose cut off. If a tavern keeper allowed criminals to meet in her bar without reporting it, she could be executed. The law wasn't just detailed, it was personal, and it created a city where everyone, from priest to potter, knew the stakes. You pass a stone bench where two older men sit sipping beer from long straws. One tells a story, the other laughs, then glances around as if checking to see who might be listening. Even jokes have limits here. Across the street, a young girl sweeps the threshold of her home. Her eyes flick to you, linger for a second, then return to her work. She's seen strangers before. Maybe she knows that strangers don't last long here. Babylon may be lawful, but it is not safe. It is a city where justice is quick, public, and sometimes arbitrary. Where the poor can be punished for the same crimes the wealthy commit without consequence. Where guilt and innocence can be decided by water. You turn down a quieter alley, footsteps muffled by packed dirt. You haven't stolen, you haven't lied. You haven't kissed anyone's wife or collapsed any buildings. And still, your heart races, because Babylon doesn't wait for guilt to act. It punishes suspicion, and sometimes, being in the wrong place at the wrong time is all it takes. Night has finally come, but Babylon doesn't sleep. Not really. The city just shifts again, slipping into a version of itself that's slower, darker, and far more uncertain. You notice it in the silence first, not complete, but different. The clatter of carts and the sharp edge of marketplace shouting has faded. In its place, you hear low conversations behind shuttered windows, the occasional bark of a dog, the thump of distant drums. The heat has broken, but the air still clings to your skin, warm and close like a breath on your neck. Lanterns flicker in alcoves. Oil lamps glow behind woven screens. The streets are still passable, but you need to watch your step, not just for stones or waste, but for the kinds of people who prefer the cover of night. The night watch has begun. These were Babylon's unofficial security, sometimes temple guards, sometimes hired men, often a mixture of both. They weren't organized like a police force, but they walked their routes with authority. Some carried short clubs, others had knives tucked into their belts. You see two of them now, their shadows long and stretched as they pass by a small shrine. They don't acknowledge you, but they notice you. You duck into a side street, quieter and more private. Above you, the rooftops are coming to life. Babylonian homes often had flat roofs where people would eat, sleep, and escape the heat of the day. In the cooler night air, families gather there. Children chasing each other in silence. Parents lying on mats, looking up at the stars. The stars here are sharp, scattered across the blackness like crushed salt on obsidian, and they mattered. Every one of them. Babylon was one of the birthplaces of astronomy. The priests at the great temple of Marduk didn't just pray, they watched the sky. They recorded eclipses, tracked planetary movements, mapped the rise and fall of constellations. They believed the heavens were messages, carefully written in patterns of light. If Venus appeared in the wrong quadrant, a harvest might fail. If Jupiter aligned with Mars, a king might die. To the priests and scribes, reading the stars was as essential as reading clay tablets. The sky was their newspaper, their calendar, their weather forecast, and their warning system. You lie down briefly beside a cool brick wall and look up. The stars are so bright they seem unreal. You spot a few constellations, or at least what would later become them. The Babylonian sky had its own system, the plough, the great twins, the lion. They were different from the Greek versions, you know. But just as important, a man walks past you, humming softly to himself. He carries a small cage with something moving inside, a bird, maybe. Offerings for tomorrow, or an omen reader heading home late. No one else speaks. The city has become a whisper, and yet the danger remains. At night, the risks change. Fewer witnesses, fewer guards, fewer rules. Crimes that would never happen during daylight suddenly become tempting. Theft, assault, disappearance. Babylonian houses didn't have locks in the way you know them. Doors were wooden, sometimes reinforced, but they relied mostly on neighbors and fear to keep them closed. If someone wanted in badly enough, they'd get in. You cross into a wealthier part of the city now. The homes are larger here, with painted doors and higher walls. Even the torches burn brighter. Somewhere nearby, you hear the low hum of a private gathering, music played on a lyre, gentle conversation, the clink of ceramic cups, nobles and priests winding down after a long day of being important. You won't be joining them. You follow the sound of running water instead. Babylon's canals and water channels continued their work, even at night. The larger canals branched into smaller ones, feeding wells and cisterns. You sit beside one now, dipping your hands into the cool water. It tastes faintly of clay, but it's clean enough. A few others join you. A boy carrying an empty jar, a man leading a tired donkey, a woman washing her arms. No one speaks. You all simply exist in this narrow slice of moonlight, touching the same water that flowed past the temple hours ago. There's something ancient and comforting in that. You ask yourself again, where will you sleep? There are no inns with glowing signs, no hostiles with polite staff. If you don't have a home, or a friend, or a doorway someone's willing to share, you sleep outside. Some rooftops are open and unguarded. You could try one, but that brings its own risks. Other wanderers, guards with questions, or someone's dog. You find a quiet alcove instead, near an old shrine that seems half forgotten. A small fire has burned here recently. The ground is warm, the ashes fresh. You curl against the wall, knees pulled in, trying to make yourself smaller. And you listen. You hear the wind rustling reeds by the canal, a soft cough somewhere far off, the occasional footsteps of a guard or a straying goat. Somewhere in the distance, a woman sings a lullaby, not loud, not performed, just a rhythm to help someone else sleep. You breathe out slowly. You've made it to the end of the day. And in Babylon, that's no small feat. You didn't get arrested. You didn't offend a god, at least not publicly. You didn't drown in the river or get caught with someone else's property. You worked, ate, sweated, and avoided death. That's a win. But even here, lying still in the shadows, you understand something. This city doesn't rest. Not really. The gods are still watching. The scribes are still writing. The stars are still speaking in a language only the priests can read. And when morning comes, Babylon will start again, ruthless, brilliant, and as unforgiving as ever. Sleep, if you can. But keep one eye open. You wake just before dawn. Not gently, not with a yawn and a stretch, but with a stiff back, a dry mouth, and the unmistakable feeling that someone just walked past you too closely. When you glance up, there's no one there, just an alley bathed in dim blue light and the faint smell of last night's fire smoke. Your body aches, your head's foggy, but you've survived your first full day and night in Babylon, and now, like everything else in this city, you're about to be tested again. The early hours in Babylon are deceptive. There's a moment, just before sunrise, when the city feels almost peaceful. Chickens begin to stir in their pens. A few street dogs stretch and scratch at their ears. The stars have started to fade. but the sky hasn't yet caught fire. You could almost believe it's safe. Then the shouting starts. It's not angry, not yet, just people claiming their places. Vendors preparing stalls, servants fetching water, scribes sweeping thresholds in front of their homes. Imagine cool air on your face, animals bleating, doors slamming open. A normal morning. You, however, are not normal. You're a stranger, a foreigner. And in this city, that makes you a liability. You try to look busy, helpful. Maybe you fetch a jar. Maybe you offer to sweep. Maybe someone waves you off. Or maybe they yell. Either way, it's clear your presence is noticed. You decide it's best to keep moving. But Babylon is not letting go of you that easily. You turn a corner and find yourself face to face with a man in polished linen robes. He's flanked by 2 guards. You don't understand the words, but his posture says enough. You're being questioned. He gestures to your tunic, your bare feet, your tired eyes. Then he says something sharp and short. One of the guards steps closer. Here it is. The moment you knew was coming. In a city so tightly wound around its own systems, you've slipped through every one of them. No seal, no job, no name on a tablet, no contracts, no offerings. You've done nothing wrong, but that hardly matters. The question isn't, did you break a law? The question is, who believes you did? The man waves a hand and turns away. The guards don't. You're taken, not roughly, but firmly, through the streets as the city wakes. People glance up from their morning tasks, then look away again. Nothing to see, just another stranger being corrected. You're led to a shaded courtyard near what looks like a public records hall. A group of scribes sits behind low wooden tables, their hands already darkened with clay. A short exchange. A tablet is retrieved, and then they ask your name. You try to answer. You point to yourself, gesture vaguely. One of the scribes begins scratching something onto a blank tablet. Another watches you closely. This could go badly, or it could simply end, because sometimes Babylon didn't need a trial. If you were unregistered, without family, without work, you could simply be removed, not killed, just escorted to the edge of the city and left. Outside the walls, the world was less forgiving. The desert didn't care about tablets, and Babylon didn't care about ghosts. But just as the guards are motioning to take you again, a boy runs into the courtyard, the same one who helped you with the bread stall yesterday. He says something, quickly, to the scribe. Then he points to you. There's a long pause. Then the scribe nods. The boy grins and runs off again. No explanation. No thanks. Just survival. You're released. No punishment. No fine. Just a look that says, don't make us regret this. You walk, slowly, away from the courtyard, from the guards, from the law. And this time, you don't stop until you reach the city gates. You stand there, just inside the massive walls, looking out toward the pale horizon. The desert lies beyond. It looks empty, but you know better. Caravans will come soon, long lines of camels and ox carts, bringing goods from far-off cities, and among them other strangers. Just like you, they'll think they're ready for Babylon. They're not. You weren't. Because surviving here isn't just about avoiding danger. It's about understanding the rhythm, the contracts, the glances, the tiny rules no one says out loud. It's about knowing when to speak and when to kneel, when to pay and when to vanish. You take one last look at the city behind you, the towering ziggurats, the domed roofs, the red clay paths twisting between shrines and shops. It's beautiful, it's terrible, and it's not for you. You step forward, just once. Just enough to feel the heat already rising off the sand outside, and you realize something. You weren't exiled. You were lucky. Because Babylon doesn't always give warnings. Sometimes it just swallows. So now, as the last echoes of Babylon fade from your mind, you can let your body soften into stillness. Breathe a little deeper. Let your shoulders drop. Let the tension you've been holding melt away like mist at dawn. Picture those towering walls behind you, the baked brick streets fading into distance, the shimmer of torches flickering in the night. It's all quiet now. The city sleeps, or pretends to, and you are no longer in its grasp. You are safe, here, in your own stillness. Let the hum of clay tablets and temple chants grow softer. Let the sound of market cries and rushing canals drift into silence. And instead, imagine cool air on your face. Imagine stars hanging gently above you. Imagine being carried far, far away from law and heat and worry, into a place where the only thing asked of you is rest. Slow your breath. Feel your heartbeat settle. There is nothing more to do. No shrines to visit, no bricks to lift, no scribe waiting with a tablet, only you and peace. Sleep well and good night.